The year 1870 bled across the plains like a persistent wound, and the town of Harmony Creek was a scab on the sun-scorched flesh of the Arizona Territory. It wasn't a place of harmony, not in any real sense. It was a place of survival, where the dust settled on everything, on the unpainted boards of the general store, on the sweat-slicked hats of the men who loitered outside the saloon, and on the silent, unspoken dreams of its women. The town huddled under a sky so vast and blue it felt like a judgment. All around it, the land stretched out, a canvas of cracked earth, stubborn sagebrush, and rolling sandhills that shimmered in the heat, promising nothing but more of the same. In a two-story house that stood a little taller and a little prouder than the rest, Clara Mae Thompson felt that same dust settling on her soul. At 19, she had a face the town considered pretty in a quiet, fragile way, skin kept pale by bonnets and parasols, eyes the color of a summer evening sky, and a mouth that seemed perpetually on the verge of asking a question she'd been taught never to voice. On the surface, she was the dutiful daughter, a porcelain doll of piety and obedience, but beneath the starched cotton of her dress, a wild, untamed thing paced like a caged wolf. It was a yearning for something more than this suffocating heat, more than the scripted conversations in the church hall, more than the life her parents had meticulously laid out for her like a burial shroud. That shroud was taking the shape of a wedding dress. It lay spread across her bed, a mountain of imported lace and silk that had cost a fortune. It was a beautiful thing, a testament to the wealth and status of her intended, Mr. Nathaniel Blackwood. And Clara hated it with a passion that frightened her. Nathaniel Blackwood was the undisputed king of Harmony Creek. He owned the largest cattle ranch, the freight company, and it was whispered, the sheriff. He was a man carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding mesas, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and eyes as cold and gray as river stones. When he looked at Clara, he didn't see a woman. He saw a prize, a beautiful, well-bred mare to adorn his estate and solidify his dynasty. He spoke of taming her spirit as one might speak of breaking a horse, and the casual brutality in his words made Clara's blood run cold. Her parents saw only security. He's a powerful man. Clara, her father, a merchant whose success was increasingly tied to Blackwood's goodwill, would say, "He will provide for you. You will want for nothing." Her mother, a woman whose own youthful fire had long been banked to a dull ember, would pat her hand. This is how the world works. Child, a woman finds her safety in a good match. Love is a storybook fancy. Respect and security are what last. But Clara felt no safety in Nathaniel's presence. She felt only the cold shadow of his control. His touch was proprietary. His compliments were commands. And his vision for their future was a cage gilded with his wealth. The approaching engagement party, set for Saturday night, felt less like a celebration and more like the final turning of a key in a lock. With each passing day, the air in her room grew thinner. The beautiful dress on her bed seemed to mock her, and the wild thing in her chest grew more frantic. On the Friday afternoon before the party, the house was a hive of frantic preparation. Her mother was directing the servants. Her father was overseeing a delivery of whiskey from the east, and the scent of baking bread and roasting meat filled the air, thick and cloying. Voices drifted up the stairs, sharp, critical, full of expectations she could never meet. "Is Miss Clara ready for her fitting? Make sure her hair is done just so. Mr. Blackwood appreciates a neat appearance. She's been so quiet lately. Nerves. I suppose all brides feel it." Clara couldn't breathe. The walls of her room, covered in a delicate floral paper, felt like they were pressing in on her. She looked at the dress, then at her reflection in the mirror, a pale, trapped girl with haunted eyes. She had to get out. Slipping out the back door, she avoided the bustling kitchen and headed for the one place on the property that felt like her own, the old stables. The main stables, closer to the house, were Mr. Blackwood's domain now. filled with his prized stallions. But the older, smaller structure at the far end of the property was a place of quiet and memory. It smelled of old hay, worn leather, and the ghosts of the ponies she had loved as a child. It was a place of solitude, where the world and its demands seemed to fade away. The afternoon sun was a physical weight, pressing down on the parched land. The air was still, broken only by the buzz of a lazy fly and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. As Clara neared the old stable, she slowed her steps, savoring the silence. But it wasn't silent. A sound, low and rough, cut through the heavy air, a metallic scrape, followed by a muffled curse. Clara froze, her hand flying to her throat. The sound had come from the small, windowless tack room built onto the side of the stable, a place she hadn't entered in years. It was used for storing broken equipment and old saddles. But more than that, it was a place she'd been explicitly forbidden to go near. Weeks ago, Mr. Blackwood's men had reinforced the door and added a heavy iron bolt. When she'd asked her father why, he had dismissed her with a wave of his hand. Nathaniel's business. It doesn't concern you. Now, her father's dismissal felt less like a protection and more like a lie. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, warred with years of ingrained obedience. She took a tentative step closer. The sound came again, a grunt of pain this time, followed by the distinct, rhythmic clink of a chain. It was the sound of a living creature, an animal, perhaps, caught in a trap. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She crept to the heavy wooden door. A sliver of light pierced the gloom through a crack in the boards. She pressed her eye to it, her breath held tight in her chest. At first, all she could see was darkness and dusty shapes. Then her eye adjusted. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. He was caged. An iron cage, the kind used for transporting dangerous animals, had been erected in the center of the small room, and inside it, a man sat on the dirt floor, his back against the bars. He was tall, even sitting down, with a frame that spoke of lean, hard strength. His clothes were little more than rags. His dark hair was a tangled mess, and a thick, untrimmed beard covered his lower face. One of his arms was chained to the bars above his head, the wrist raw and bloody. There was a dark, crusted gash on his forehead, and his face was a mask of bruises and dirt. He shifted, and his head turned slightly. She could see his profile, the sharp line of his jaw beneath the beard. He wasn't old, perhaps 25, maybe a few years more. As she watched, he reached with his free hand, slowly and deliberately, to touch a fresh cut on his cheek, his fingers surprisingly gentle. He winced, but his expression remained impassive, a stoic calm that was more unsettling than any cry of outrage. Clara felt a gasp build in her throat, but she swallowed it down, choking on a mixture of fear and a strange, unwelcome surge of compassion. Who was he? What had he done to deserve being kept like this? She pulled back from the door, her mind racing. This had to be Nathaniel's doing. This was the business that didn't concern her. Her fiancé, the pillar of the community, was keeping a man in a cage in her own backyard. The image was so brutal, so fundamentally wrong, that it seemed to crack the very foundation of her world. She should have turned and run. She should have gone back to the house, locked her door, and pretended she had seen nothing. That was what a proper young woman would do. But the wild thing inside her, the part of her that chafed at its own cage of lace and etiquette, would not let her leave. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she slid the heavy iron bolt. It groaned in protest, the sound deafening in the stillness. She pulled the door open just enough to slip inside, her eyes wide as she took in the full scene. The room stank of sweat, dirt, and something metallic that she recognized as blood. The heat was suffocating. The man's head snapped up. For the first time, she saw his eyes. They were a startlingly clear gray, the color of a stormy sky, and they fixed on her with a sharp, piercing intelligence. There was no fear in them, no pleading. There was only a weary watchfulness, a deep, bone-tired stillness that seemed to absorb all the chaos around him. He didn't speak. He simply watched her as she stood frozen in the doorway, a ghost in a pale dress against the blinding sunlight. Who are you?" The words came out as a whisper, thin and reedy. His eyes swept over her, taking in her fine dress, her soft hands, the terror plain on her face. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He looked away, his gaze falling to the dirt floor. He seemed to gather himself, his silence a wall she could not penetrate. "What are you doing here?" she tried again, her voice a little stronger. "Why are you like this?" He finally looked back at her, and this time a flicker of something, irony, perhaps, or disdain, passed through his gaze. "What does it look like, ma'am? I'm enjoying the hospitality." His voice was a low rasp, dry from thirst. The sarcasm, so unexpected, startled her out of her fear. "That's not an answer." He gave a slight, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You shouldn't be here. Go back to the big house." "Not until you tell me what's happened." The words were out before she could stop them, a thread of her own defiance finally showing. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "They say I stole a horse," he said at last, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "One of Mr. Blackwood's prize stallions." "Nathaniel, of course. Did you?" she asked, the question hanging in the stifling air between them. He met her gaze directly, and the intensity in his eyes made her feel as if he could see straight through her, past the polished exterior to the frantic creature within. "No, ma'am, I did not." He said it with such simple, unwavering certainty that Clara found herself, inexplicably, believing him. "There was no proof," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "No one saw anything. But Mr. Blackwood's word is law in this town. He said he wanted me held, said he'd arrange for a marshal to take me to Prescott for trial, away from any local sympathies." He gestured with his chin toward the chains. "This is his idea of a holding cell." Clara stared at the raw flesh of his wrist, at the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. She thought of Nathaniel's cold smile, of his talk of taming things, of his absolute need for control. This wasn't justice. This was possession, the same way he possessed his land, his cattle, and soon, her. The man in the cage was a stolen horse, an inconvenient truth, an object to be dealt with and disposed of. And in his calm, defiant eyes, Clara saw a reflection of her own caged spirit. She stood there, trapped between two worlds, the world of the big house, with its stifling propriety and its gilded cage of a marriage, and this dark, foul-smelling room, which held a terrible secret but also a spark of raw, undeniable truth. To retreat meant accepting her fate, to stay, to act. That was a path she couldn't yet see. But as she looked at the silent, wounded cowboy, she knew one thing for certain. She would not be going back to the house. Not yet. The lock on his cage was a challenge, and the question of his guilt was a stone thrown into the still, stagnant waters of her life, and the ripples were just beginning to spread. Clara did not run. She did not scream. She did not return to the house and faint prettily into her mother's arms. Instead, she backed away from the stifling tack room, her movements slow and deliberate, and slid the heavy bolt back into place. The sound was a hollow thud, a note of finality that echoed the slamming of a door inside her own heart. She had crossed a line, and she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that she could not go back. She told no one. The secret of the man in the cage became a hot, heavy stone she carried in her gut. That evening, at a dinner table laden with roast chicken and her mother's anxious chatter about the engagement party, Clara moved food around her plate, her mind a world away. She saw Nathaniel Blackwood at the head of the table, laughing at one of her father's sycophantic jokes, and for the first time, she truly looked at him. She saw the hard set of his jaw, the possessive glint in his eyes as they swept over her, the casual cruelty in the way he dismissed a servant for spilling a drop of wine. He was not just a domineering man. He was a man who built cages. That night, sleep was a distant shore she couldn't reach. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw a pair of stormy gray eyes, weary but unbroken. She heard the dry rasp of his voice. She felt the oppressive heat of that small, dark room. Before the first hint of dawn painted the sky, she was up, moving on silent feet. She crept down to the kitchen. She filled a water skin from the pump, her hands shaking so badly she could barely secure the stopper. She took a loaf of leftover bread and a piece of dried venison, wrapping them in a piece of cloth. The journey back to the old stable felt a mile long. Every shadow was a threat, every rustle of leaves a potential discovery. When she slid the bolt back, the groan of the metal was like a gunshot in the pre-dawn quiet. He was awake, of course. He was leaning against the bars, exactly where she had left him, as if he hadn't moved at all. But his head was up, his gaze fixed on the door. He had been waiting. She said nothing, simply knelt and pushed the water skin and the cloth-wrapped food through the bars. His eyes followed her movements, wary and intense. He looked at the offering, then back at her, a question in his gaze. "You need it," she whispered. He reached for the water skin with his free hand, his movement slow, deliberate. He drank deeply, the sound of his swallowing loud in the small space. He didn't thank her, not with words, but when he lowered the skin, he met her eyes, and there was a flicker of something in their depths, not gratitude, perhaps, but a grudging acknowledgement, a crack in his wall of stoicism. She came again that evening, and again the next morning. Their encounters were brief, silent affairs, exchanges of sustenance for secrets. She learned to move like a ghost, to read the rhythms of the household, to know when she could slip away unnoticed. The tack room became a strange sort of confessional, a sanctuary from the lies of the main house. And slowly, the man in the cage began to talk. It started with a name. She had just given him a piece of apple she'd pocketed from the kitchen. As he ate it, she sat on the dirt floor a few feet from the cage, the bars a stark line between their worlds. "My name is Clara," she offered into the silence. He finished the apple, then wiped his hand on his torn trousers. He looked at her for a long time, as if weighing the value of a name. "Luke," he said finally. The name was plain, solid. It suited him. With the name came the stories, drawn from him not by her questioning but by her quiet presence. He spoke in a low, even tone, his words spare and unadorned. He told her he'd been a cavalry scout once, ranging far into the territories, learning the land until it was as familiar to him as the back of his own hand. He spoke of the immense, soul-cleansing emptiness of the plains, of sleeping under a blanket of stars so thick you could almost touch them. For the first time, Clara heard someone speak of the wilderness, not as a thing to be conquered and fenced, but as a thing to be known and respected. Then, one evening, his voice took on a heavier tone. He told her about his family. They weren't settlers, not in the usual sense. They had lived on the edge of things, trapping and trading, at peace with the local tribes, until a posse from a town further south, drunk on whiskey and fear after a supposed raid, had mistaken his family's camp for a hostile one. They had come in the night with torches. "I was away," Luke said, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point. "Tracking a mountain lion. When I got back, there was nothing left but smoke and ghosts." He didn't describe the horror. He didn't have to. The stark emptiness in his voice painted a picture more terrible than any words. Clara felt a profound ache in her chest, a sorrow so deep it was almost physical. Her own life, with its manufactured troubles, seemed trivial, childish, in the face of such raw loss. This, she realized, was a man who knew what it was to have everything taken from him. It explained the stillness in him, the hard-won calm of a man who had already endured the worst the world could do. It was 2 nights before the engagement party that he told her the rest, the story that connected his past to her present. "The fire, it took my folks," he said, his chained arm straining slightly against its bond. "But my younger brother, Silas, he was just a boy, 17. He got away. He found me a few days later." For a moment, Luke's composure broke. He squeezed his eyes shut, a spasm of pain crossing his face. "We were all each other had left. We drifted for a couple of years. Took odd jobs. Last spring, we signed on with a cattle drive heading up from Texas. There was a man, a foreman named Jedediah Stone, a hard man with a cruel streak. He and Silas never saw eye to eye. One night, outside of dusty nowhere, they had words over a card game. I broke it up, but the look in Stone's eyes, I saw it. The next morning, Silas was gone. Stone said he'd taken his pay and run off in the night. I knew it was a lie. Silas would never have left without me." Luke opened his eyes, and they were burning with a cold fire. "I left the drive. I spent the last 6 months tracking Stone. I found out he'd drifted up this way, got himself hired by a big rancher, a man with a reputation for hiring men who don't ask too many questions. I was 2 days out of Harmony Creek when 3 of Blackwood's men jumped me. They beat me, dragged me here, and told me the boss wanted a word. Blackwood accused me of trying to steal his prize stud. It was a lie, clean and simple. I wasn't after his horse. I was after Jedediah Stone. I was after justice for my brother." The pieces clicked into place in Clara's mind with sickening clarity. Nathaniel wasn't just holding a horse thief. He was protecting a murderer. He was shielding a man like Stone to keep his operation running smoothly, to maintain his grip on the territory. Luke wasn't a criminal. He was a threat to Nathaniel's carefully constructed empire. Nathaniel's words from weeks ago came back to her, whispered in the parlor as he presented her with a pearl necklace. "Everything in my world, Clara, is either an asset or a liability, and I take care of my liabilities." He had smiled then. "I will tame this wild land, and I will tame you, my dear. A firm hand is all it takes." At the time, she had felt a chill. Now, she felt pure dread. The firm hand wasn't a metaphor. It was chains and cages and lies. He would not just tame her. He would break her, just as he was trying to break Luke. Her inner world was a maelstrom of conflict. Every day was a performance. She sat through dress fittings, her body rigid as her mother and the seamstress fussed over lace and silk. She attended the church social, accepting congratulations from townspeople with a smile that felt like a mask of glass, ready to shatter. She allowed Nathaniel to place his hand on the small of her back, and his touch felt like a brand. But for a few stolen minutes each dawn and dusk, she was herself. In the dim, dusty light of the tack room, she wasn't Nathaniel Blackwood's future bride. She was just Clara, and he wasn't just a prisoner. He was Luke, the only person in her entire life who spoke to her without artifice, who looked at her and saw not a prize to be won, but a person he would ask about her day, and his quiet attention made her feel more seen than she had ever felt under the adoring gaze of her fiancé. He listened, truly listened, and in his presence, the wild thing in her chest could finally breathe. The night of the engagement party arrived like a death sentence. The house blazed with light, the sound of a hired fiddler and laughter spilling out into the darkness. Clara stood in front of her mirror, encased in an ice blue silk gown that rustled with every breath. She looked beautiful. She looked like a stranger. She endured it for an hour. She danced with her father. She accepted a glass of champagne from Nathaniel, who toasted loudly to his beautiful, dutiful bride. The hypocrisy was a poison in her throat. Making an excuse of the heat, she slipped out a side door and, cloaked in shadows, ran to the stables. When she entered the tack room, Luke was on his feet, his free hand gripping the bars, listening to the faint music from the house. He turned as she entered, his eyes taking in her finery. For the first time, A complex emotion crossed his face, something akin to pain. "You look like a queen," he said, his voice low. "I feel like a fraud," she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "This isn't you," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "No," she whispered. "It's not." She moved closer to the cage, her silk dress brushing against the dusty floor. All the fear, the anger, the hopeless despair of the past few days rose up inside her. She looked at his chained wrist, the skin broken and inflamed. Without thinking, she reached through the bars, her fingers gently touching the raw flesh just above the iron manacle. His skin was hot, rough beneath her soft fingertips. He flinched at her touch, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't pull away. A current, powerful and undeniable, passed between them. It was a jolt of shared suffering, of recognition, of a desperate, impossible longing. He slowly lowered his gaze from her eyes to her hand on his arm, then raised his free hand and carefully, hesitantly, covered her fingers with his own. His hand was large, calloused, and surprisingly warm. It enveloped hers completely. They stood there in the charged silence, the distant music a world away. He wasn't a prisoner and she wasn't a lady. They were just Luke and Clara, two souls trapped in cages of different kinds, connected by a simple, profound touch. She looked up from their joined hands to his face. His eyes held hers, and in their stormy depths, she saw an emotion so powerful it stole her breath. It was more than sympathy, more than gratitude. It was a fire that mirrored the one just beginning to burn in her own heart, a feeling that was terrifying, reckless, and more real than anything she had ever known. The touch lingered long after she had pulled her hand away, a phantom heat on her skin. It was a brand, not of ownership like Nathaniel's, but of connection, a silent pact made in the dusty darkness. The engagement party had ended, the false laughter had faded, and Clara lay in her bed. The ice-blue silk gown pooled on the floor like a cast-off skin. But for the first time in months, she was not thinking of her own cage. She was thinking of how to break Luke's story. His accusation against Jedediah Stone and Nathaniel's direct involvement had planted a seed of cold, hard purpose in her heart. She could no longer exist in the hazy ambiguity of being a dutiful daughter. She had to know the truth, not just the truth he had told her, but the undeniable, black and white truth that the law would recognize, even if the law in Harmony Creek was a bought and paid for commodity. Her opportunity came 2 days later. Her father was meeting with Sheriff Miller in the parlor, a regular occurrence where ledgers were reviewed and palms were greased with Nathaniel Blackwood's money. Clara served them coffee, her hands steady, her expression placid. She listened as they spoke of land deeds and water rights, her mind 1,000 miles away, cataloging the layout of the small, dusty building that served as the town's jail and the sheriff's office. She knew Sheriff Miller was a man of lazy habits, more interested in the comfort of the saloon than the rigors of his office. That night, she waited until the house was still, until the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Dressed in a simple dark skirt and blouse, her hair tied back, she slipped out into the moonless dark. The town was asleep, a collection of dark shapes huddled under the vast, indifferent stars. The sheriff's office was at the end of the main street, a single-story structure with a false front. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her, but the image of Luke's chained wrist burned hotter. She circled to the back of the building, to the single grimy window she'd noted earlier. As she'd hoped, Sheriff Miller's laziness was her ally. The window was unlocked, with a pained squeak of dry wood. She pushed it open and hoisted herself inside, landing silently on the dusty floor. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke, whiskey, and unread paper. A desk was cluttered with wanted posters and legal forms, by the faint light filtering through the front window. She began her search, her fingers, accustomed to embroidery and piano keys, trembled as they sifted through official documents. She was looking for a warrant, a writ of detainment, any piece of paper with Luke's name on it. She searched for what felt like an eternity, her ears straining for the sound of footsteps on the boardwalk outside. She went through the main drawer, then the side drawers. She checked the stack of papers held down by a glass paperweight. There were records of fines paid, deeds of sale, a complaint about stray dogs. There was nothing. No official record of the man being held in her family's stable. He did not legally exist. He was a ghost, a non-person, held captive solely by the will of Nathaniel Blackwood. It was all the proof she needed. Luke hadn't just been wronged. He had been erased. Clara slid back out the window, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The fear was gone, replaced by a crystalline, dangerous anger. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Blackwood was beginning to notice the change in his fiancée. The demure, pliable girl he had chosen was becoming elusive. There was a new light in her eyes, a firmness in her jaw. She met his gaze now instead of looking down. She answered his questions with a disconcerting directness, her own questions subtly probing. He would find her staring out the window, her thoughts clearly miles away. And when he spoke her name, she would start, as if returning from a long journey. He attributed it to pre-wedding nerves at first, but his instincts, honed by years of managing difficult men and breaking stubborn animals, told him it was something more. He felt his control, the thing he valued above all else, slipping. "You seem distracted, my dear," he said one evening as they sat on her family's veranda. He reached out and captured her hand, his grip a little too tight. "There is much to think about," Clara replied, gently but firmly extracting her fingers from his. His eyes narrowed. "See that your thoughts remain where they belong, on our future." The next day, she noticed a new face among the ranch hands loitering in town, a man with a cruel mouth and shifty eyes that seemed to follow her. She recognized the description instantly. Jedediah Stone. Nathaniel hadn't just hired him, he had brought him close, a guard dog for his secrets. And now, that dog was watching her. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through her, but it only strengthened her resolve. She had to act. She had to get Luke out before Nathaniel's suspicion curdled into certainty. That evening, in the tack room, she told Luke what she had found, or rather, what she hadn't. "There's no record of you," she whispered, her voice urgent. "No warrant. He's holding you outside the law entirely." Luke's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. "I figured as much." "And Nathaniel, he's watching me. He has Jedediah Stone following me." At the mention of the name, a dangerous light flared in Luke's eyes. "Stone is here." "Yes, which means we're running out of time." Clara took a deep breath. "I'm going to get you out." Luke looked at her, truly looked at her. And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw a flicker of alarm in his eyes. "Clara, no, it's too dangerous. If he catches you..." "He has you in a cage. Luke," she countered, her voice fierce. "He speaks of me as if I am a horse to be broken. We are already caught. The only question is whether we fight back." His protest died on his lips. He saw the iron in her spine, the unshakable conviction in her eyes. He was a man who understood survival, and he recognized a fellow survivor. Over the next 2 nights, they planned. Their hurried, whispered conversations were a tapestry of risk and logistics. The new moon was in 3 nights. The darkness would be their shield. The problem was the lock on the cage and the manacle on his wrist. They were thick, forged iron. The blacksmith, Luke murmured, "He'll have a set of bolt cutters, or a heavy file." "I can get them," Clara said, her mind already working. Old man Hemlock, the blacksmith, was nearly deaf and drank himself to sleep every night. His workshop was a cluttered mess, but the tools were there, another risk, another law to be broken in the service of a greater justice. The plan was simple, desperate. On the night of the new moon, she would steal the cutters from the blacksmith's shop. She would bring them to the stable, cut the lock, and then the chain. Luke would slip away into the hills, following the creek bed west until he was clear of Blackwood's territory. He argued with her, telling her to just leave the tool and go, to not be there when he broke free. But she refused. "I started this," she insisted. "I will see it through." The night before their desperate gamble, a storm was brewing. The air was thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken energy that mirrored the turmoil in Clara's own soul. Wind soughed through the eaves of the house, rattling the windows. Nathaniel had been called away to one of his outlying cattle camps, a small reprieve that Clara clung to like a lifeline. She made her final visit to the tack room, carrying a small bundle with a canteen of water, a chunk of cheese, and a strip of dried beef for his journey. He was standing, waiting for her, his frame a tense silhouette in the gloom. "The wind is good," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It'll cover any sound." "Are you ready?" she asked, her own voice trembling slightly. "I was born ready for this," he replied. But his eyes told a different story. They were fixed on her, full of a fierce, aching tenderness that made her heart contract. He was ready to be free, but he was not ready to leave her. She pushed the bundle through the bars. Her fingers brushed against his, and she didn't pull away. The silence stretched, filled only by the rising shriek of the wind. All the things they couldn't say, the thanks, the fears, the impossible. Burgeoning love hung in the air between them. She knew this might be the last time she would ever see him. Tomorrow, he would be a ghost in the wilderness, and she would be left to face Nathaniel's wrath, to be sealed into her fate. The thought was unbearable, acting on an impulse that was deeper and more powerful than a lifetime of restraint. She pressed herself against the cold iron bars. The metal was a cruel barrier, a symbol of everything that kept them apart. She reached through, her hands finding his face, her fingers tracing the rough line of his jaw through his beard. He stood perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as a man dying of thirst leans toward water. And then she leaned in further, tilting her head to fit through the gap in the bars. She closed her eyes and pressed her lips to his. It was her first kiss. It was clumsy and desperate, a collision of chapped lips and frantic emotion. It tasted of dust and sweat and sorrow. It was nothing like the chaste, passionless kisses she had read about in books, and everything her soul had been crying out for. It was a kiss of rebellion, a brand of loyalty, a frantic prayer sent up into the storm. He responded with a deep groan, his free hand coming up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her to him as if he could absorb her into himself, as if he could protect her even through the iron that separated them. The kiss was too short and lasted an eternity. When she finally pulled back, her breath was ragged, her lips tingling. Tears tracked clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming force of what had just passed between them. He rested his forehead against the bars, his eyes still closed. "Clara," he breathed, her name a prayer and a curse. She kept her hand on his cheek, her thumb stroking his skin. She looked at this broken, defiant man, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that her heart was his. It didn't matter what vows were forced from her lips in a church. Her soul had made its choice here, in the dark, beside a cage. She leaned close one last time, her lips brushing against his ear, the wind whipping her hair against the bars. "I am to be another man's wife," she whispered, her voice raw with a pain that was also a promise. "But I do not belong to him." The night of the new moon was a void. The sky was a swath of black velvet, starless and absolute, offering no comfort and no light. The wind from the previous night had died, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. It was a perfect night for secrets, for ghosts, for desperate gambles. Clara moved through this void like a shadow. She had changed out of her fine dresses into a boy's worn trousers and a dark shirt, borrowed from a stable-hand's laundry line. The unfamiliar clothes were a suit of armor, freeing her from the constraints of her old life. In her hand, she clutched a small leather pouch containing the heavy, oiled steel bolt cutters she had taken from Old Man Hemlock's workshop an hour earlier. The blacksmith had been snoring in his back room, the air thick with the smell of cheap whiskey. The weight of the tool was immense, a heavy, cold promise in her hand. Every step from the blacksmith's to the far stables was a study in terror. The crunch of her boots on the dry ground sounded like a cannon shot. A hooting owl made her freeze, heart hammering against her ribs. She imagined eyes in every dark window, a threat behind every skeletal cactus. But the memory of Luke's face, the feel of his lips against hers, was a fire in her belly that burned hotter than her fear. This was no longer just about freeing him. It was about freeing herself. She reached the tack room, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The silence here was different, heavier. She fumbled with the bolt on the door, her fingers numb and clumsy. It slid open with a low groan that she was certain could be heard all the way at the main house. Luke was a dark shape against the deeper darkness inside. He was on his feet, poised, listening. "Clara?" he whispered, his voice a low vibration. "I'm here," she breathed, relief washing over her. "I have them?" She slipped inside, pulling the door almost closed behind her. The darkness was total. She could hear his breathing, feel the warmth of his body near the bars. "Give them to me," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Then go, now. Clara, get back to the house and lock your door. Don't be here when I break free." "No," she whispered back, her voice unyielding. "I told you, I'm seeing this through." She could feel his frustration, his fear for her, radiating through the bars. Before he could argue further, a voice cut through the night, sharp and cruel. Well, what have we here?" A lantern flared to life just outside the door, casting long, monstrous shadows. Framed in the doorway was the wiry, malevolent figure of Jedediah Stone. His teeth were yellow in the lantern light, his eyes gleaming with triumphant malice. Behind him stood two other ranch hands, their faces grim. Clara's blood ran cold. She was trapped. "I told Blackwood the little filly had a rogue streak," Stone sneered, his gaze raking over Clara's boyish clothes with open contempt. "Looks like she found herself a stray stallion to play with." "Get out of here! Clara, run!" Luke roared from inside the cage. He rattled the bars, a desperate, futile sound. "Tell them you heard a noise. Tell them you caught me trying to escape." He was trying to give her a way out, to spin a story that would save her, even now. But it was too late. Stone stepped forward, grabbing her arm in a grip of iron. "Not so fast. The boss will want to see this. He'll want to see just how his prized mare has been spending her nights." They dragged her out into the open. The night air, which had felt liberating moments before, was now cold and suffocating. Luke's shouts from the cage were a mixture of rage and despair. Lights were appearing at the main house. The commotion had roused the household. And then Nathaniel Blackwood arrived. He didn't run. He walked from the house with a long, deliberate stride, a dark coat thrown over his nightshirt. He moved with the deadly calm of a stalking panther, and, as he approached, the two ranch hands and even Stone seemed to shrink. His eyes, chips of ice in the flickering lantern light, took in the scene. Jedediah Stone holding a disheveled Clara, the open door to the tack room, the bolt cutters lying in the dust where she had dropped them. His gaze finally settled on Clara. He said nothing for a long moment, his silence more terrifying than any shout. "What is the meaning of this?" he finally asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Found her here, boss," Stone said, shoving Clara forward. "Trying to break him out." Nathaniel's eyes flickered to the bolt cutters, then back to Clara's face. She met his gaze, her chin held high. Defiance the only thing she had left. She would not cry. She would not beg. A slow, cold smile spread across Nathaniel's lips. It was the most terrible expression Clara had ever seen. He stepped forward and gently brushed a piece of straw from her hair. His touch was like a spider's caress. "My poor, confused girl," he said, his voice now loud enough for her parents, who were hurrying from the house, to hear. "It seems this vagrant has filled your head with nonsense. You must be overwrought. The stress of the wedding, no doubt." He was already spinning the narrative, painting her as a hysterical female, a victim of a manipulative criminal. He was stripping her of her agency, her truth, in front of everyone. "He's not a criminal," Clara's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "You're holding him here illegally. There's no warrant." Nathaniel's smile vanished. His hand shot out and grabbed her chin, his fingers digging into her skin. "You will be silent," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. "You will go to your room, and you will prepare for your wedding. You have made a fool of yourself, and you have made a fool of me. I will not tolerate it." He released her with a shove. Then he turned to Stone. "Take him to the town square. Tie him to the fountain post. Let the whole town see what happens to horse thieves who try to corrupt innocent young women. He'll stay there until the wedding, a reminder to all of what justice looks like in Harmony Creek." He didn't even look at Luke. To him, Luke wasn't a man. He was an object, a tool to be used for a lesson. Clara was dragged back to the house, her father averting his eyes in shame, her mother weeping softly. They didn't take her to her room. They took her to a guest room at the back of the house, one with a sturdier lock. The door was slammed shut, and she heard the key turn, the sound echoing the finality of a coffin being nailed shut. She was alone. The adrenaline faded, leaving a deep, trembling fear in its wake. She had failed. She had not only failed to free Luke, she had made his situation infinitely worse. He was now a public spectacle, and she was a prisoner in her own home. The wedding, once a dreaded future, was now an imminent, unavoidable damnation. She sank to the floor, the rough wood cold against her skin. For a long while, she just sat there in the darkness, the weight of her failure crushing her. But as the hours crept by, something else began to stir beneath the fear. It was a slow-burning ember of rage, the public humiliation, Nathaniel's cold, contemptuous control, the sight of Luke being treated like an animal. It hadn't broken her. It had forged her fear into a harder, sharper weapon. She had been stripped of her reputation, her freedom, her future. She had nothing left to lose. And in that, there was a strange and terrible new strength. She rose from the floor and went to the small writing desk by the window. By the pale gray light of the approaching dawn, she found a pen, an inkwell, and a sheet of her mother's fine stationery. Her hand was perfectly steady as she began to write. "Dearest Mother." She paused, the words feeling inadequate. She dipped the pen again, and this time, the truth poured out of her. A torrent held back for a lifetime. She wrote of the cage. She wrote Luke's name and the story of his lost family, his murdered brother. She wrote about Jedediah Stone and Nathaniel's protection of him. She wrote of the sheriff's office and the missing warrant. She wrote of Nathaniel's words, his talk of taming her like a horse, of his cold, absolute need for control. She did not write of the kiss, but she wrote of the kindness she had seen in Luke's eyes, a kindness she had never seen in her fiancé's. It was a confession, an accusation, and a desperate plea. He is not just caging a man, Mother. He is caging a part of me, the part of you I have seen in your eyes when you think no one is looking. Do not let him do to me what was done to you. For the love you once had for your own freedom, I beg you, help me. She folded the letter, her tears finally falling, spotting the ink. She had no way to deliver it, but the act of writing it, of speaking her truth, had been an act of liberation. Later that morning, her mother, Eleanor, came with a tray of food. Her face was a mask of grief and shame. She wouldn't meet Clara's eyes. "The wedding will proceed tomorrow," As planned, she said, her voice flat. Nathaniel has been generous enough to overlook your hysteria. Clara looked at her mother, at the woman who had taught her to be silent, to be obedient, to accept, and she saw the flicker of the wild girl she had once been, buried deep beneath layers of duty and regret. Mother, Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. She held out the letter. Please, read this, and then decide if this is generosity, or if it is a life sentence. Eleanor hesitated, her hand trembling. She took the letter as if it were a venomous snake. She didn't open it, not yet. She placed the tray on the floor, turned, and left, locking the door behind her. Clara watched her go, a fragile, desperate hope warring with despair. In her own room, Eleanor sank into a chair, the letter unopened in her lap. She looked at her reflection in the vanity mirror. She saw a well-preserved woman, the wife of a successful merchant, the mother of a soon-to-be powerful man's bride. She saw the life she had chosen, or rather, the life that had been chosen for her. And she remembered, a flash of memory, sharp and painful as a shard of glass. A boy with laughing eyes and wind-tangled hair, a boy who smelled of pine and horses. He had offered her a life of uncertainty, of freedom, a life on the trail, following the seasons. And her father, a man much like Nathaniel Blackwood, had called him worthless, had called her a fool. He had spoken of duty, of security, of taming her wild heart. And she, frightened and obedient, had let him. She had accepted the safe match, the comfortable house, the respectable life. She had traded the wilderness for a gilded cage. With trembling fingers, she finally opened her daughter's letter. As she read, the carefully constructed walls of her life began to crumble. He speaks of me as a horse to be broken. The same words, the same sentiment, the same cage, passed down from one generation to the next. She read of Luke, of the injustice, of Nathaniel's cold-blooded tyranny. But most of all, she read her daughter's plea, and she heard the echo of her own younger self, the girl who had been too afraid to fight. Clara was not afraid. She was trapped, but she was not afraid to fight. Eleanor stood up. The placid mask had fallen away. In its place was a resolve that had lain dormant for 30 years. She looked at her reflection again, but this time she saw past the tired, respectable woman. She saw the girl with fire in her eyes. She would not let her daughter's fire be extinguished. She would pour gasoline on it. She walked to the fireplace, crumpled the letter, and tossed it into the low-burning embers. The evidence was gone. Now, only the truth remained. And she, Eleanor Thompson, was finally ready to act on it. The morning of the wedding dawned unnaturally bright, the sun a merciless white eye in a cloudless sky. It was a day for executions. In the guest room that had become her cell, Clara stood as still as a statue while her mother dressed her. The wedding gown, the mountain of lace and silk she had once despised, was now her armor. Her mother's hands, usually so prone to nervous fluttering, were steady and sure. They worked in a quiet, solemn rhythm, their movements full of unspoken understanding. When Eleanor finished with the last pearl button, she did not offer platitudes about beauty or happiness. She met her daughter's gaze in the mirror, and her eyes, clear and fierce, held a question. "Are you ready, Clara?" she asked, her voice low. "I am," Clara replied, and the words were a vow far more sacred than any she would be forced to speak in the church. She looked at her reflection. The girl who had been afraid was gone. In her place was a woman with eyes as hard and clear as glass. There were no tears left to cry. Her face was a pale, determined mask. She was a bride marching not to the altar, but to war. Outside, the town of Harmony Creek was a stage set for the grand finale of Nathaniel Blackwood's power. The church bell pealed, a hollow, clanging sound that seemed to mock the clear sky. Townspeople, dressed in their Sunday best, filled the pews, their faces a mixture of curiosity, envy, and ingrained fear. It was the event of the season, the final cementing of Blackwood's dynasty. At the edge of town, another grimmer procession was preparing, a heavy, windowless prison wagon, hitched to two stout horses, stood waiting. Inside, on a bed of dirty straw, sat Luke. He had been taken from the fountain post at dawn, his body aching, his wrists raw. Through a crack in the wagon's boards, he could hear the church bell, and the sound was a death knell for the sliver of hope he had dared to harbor. Nathaniel's plan was flawlessly cruel. As soon as the vows were spoken and Clara was legally his, the wagon would depart for Prescott, where Luke would disappear into the territorial prison system, his story and his quest for justice buried forever. The guards, two of Blackwood's most brutal men, stood by the wagon, smoking and joking, their rifles held loosely in their hands. The moment came. The music in the church swelled. It was time for the bride to make her entrance. Nathaniel Blackwood stood at the altar, a paragon of wealth and power, a smug, proprietary smile on his lips. He was a king waiting for his crown. But his bride was not coming. Instead, a figure emerged from the side door of the Thompson Mercantile. It was Eleanor Thompson, her face pale but set like granite. She was not walking toward the church. She was walking toward the prison wagon. At her side was John, the family's oldest and most loyal stable hand, a quiet, formidable man with a face like carved hickory. He carried a double-barreled shotgun, and he did not hold it loosely. They stopped directly in front of the wagon's horses, blocking their path. The guards, startled out of their complacency, straightened up. "What's this, Mrs. Thompson?" one of them growled. "This is Mr. Blackwood's business. Step aside." Eleanor ignored him. She raised her voice, and it carried across the dusty street with a strength no one in Harmony Creek had ever heard from her before. It was not the voice of a meek merchant's wife. It was the voice of a matriarch, a fury. "Nathaniel Blackwood." The name echoed, a stark challenge that cut through the festive air. Heads began to turn. The music in the church faltered. A moment later, Nathaniel himself appeared on the church steps, his face a thundercloud of irritation at the interruption. "Eleanor, what is the meaning of this spectacle?" he demanded, his voice tight with controlled rage. "The spectacle, Mr. Blackwood, is the one you have created." Eleanor's voice rang out, drawing people from the church pews out onto the street. "This farce is over. You will release the man you have been holding in that wagon, or I swear on my daughter's life, I will tell every soul in this town the truth of what you are." Nathaniel's face darkened. "You are hysterical. Your daughter's misbehavior has clearly addled your wits. Now, go back inside before you further embarrass yourself." "Do you think I am afraid of embarrassment?" Eleanor laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "I will tell them of a man named Silas, murdered on a cattle drive. I will tell them of his killer, Jedediah Stone, the man you employ and protect. I will tell them how you framed an innocent man to cover your tracks. I will speak of a conspiracy so foul that it will curdle the milk in this town for a generation. Release him, Nathaniel, or your name will be nothing but mud from here to the territorial capital." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not just a woman's hysteria. These were specific, deadly accusations. Jedediah Stone, who was standing near the back of the crowd, went pale and began to inch away. Nathaniel was stunned into silence, his mask of civility finally cracking to reveal the raw fury beneath. He had completely underestimated the quiet woman he had dismissed as a pawn. Then, something shifted in the crowd. A low murmur started at the back. It was Old Man Hemlock, the blacksmith. "She's right," he grumbled, his voice loud in the tense silence. "Blackwood's been running this town like his own personal kingdom for too long." Another voice joined in, a shopkeeper whose business had been squeezed by Blackwood's freight company. "He ain't the law." A small but determined group of men began to move forward, their faces hard. They were the ones who had suffered silently under Nathaniel's thumb, the ones who had lost land or money or dignity to his ambition. The crowd was no longer a collection of wedding guests. It was a jury, and it was turning against him. It was the moment of chaos Clara had been waiting for. While all eyes were locked on the confrontation between her mother and her fiancé, she slipped out the side door of the church, a vision in white, a ghost of a bride. She ran. Her wedding dress, a symbol of her bondage, billowed around her, the fine lace catching on sagebrush. She ignored the gasps of the onlookers, her eyes fixed on one thing only, the prison wagon. John, the stable hand, saw her coming. As part of Eleanor's desperate plan, he had pickpocketed the key from one of the guards in the initial confusion. He tossed it to her. "The horses are in the alley. Miss Clara, go!" Her fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled with the heavy iron lock. It felt like an eternity. Inside, Luke had been thrown against the wall by the wagon's lurch and was now peering through the crack, his mind struggling to comprehend the scene. He saw Eleanor's stand, the town's anger, and then, impossibly, he saw Clara, his angel of vengeance in a wedding dress, wrestling with the lock on his prison. The lock clicked open. She threw the door wide. "Luke, it's time to go!" He stared at her, his face a mask of awe and disbelief. She didn't wait. She climbed into the wagon, grabbed his arm, and pulled him out into the blinding sunlight. He was weak, stumbling, but the sight of her, the fire in her eyes, sent a surge of strength through him. Nathaniel, seeing his entire world unraveling, finally broke. His plans, his bride, his reputation, all turning to dust before his eyes. A primal roar of fury erupted from his throat. "No!" he bellowed. He shoved his way through the crowd, his face contorted with rage. "She is mine!" Clara and Luke were already running for the alley where two saddled horses stood waiting. John stood his ground, the shotgun leveled at Nathaniel's men, holding them back for a precious few seconds. They scrambled onto the horses, Clara hiking her heavy skirts up, her movements clumsy but desperate. Luke swung himself into the saddle behind her on the larger horse, his arms encircling her waist, his body a shield for hers. With a kick, they were off, galloping out of the alley and onto the open plain, leaving the chaos of Harmony Creek behind. But Nathaniel Blackwood was not a man to accept defeat. He ripped a rifle from the saddle of a nearby horse. The crowd scattered as he raised the weapon to his shoulder, his eyes burning with a mad, possessive fire. He took aim at the fleeing figures. "If I cannot have you," he screamed into the wind, "no one will!" The rifle cracked, the sound sharp and final. Clara felt a violent jolt from behind. Luke cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and his grip on her tightened convulsively. She looked down and saw a dark stain blossoming on the white silk of her sleeve, spreading from where his shoulder was pressed against her. It was blood, dark, crimson red against the virginal white. "Luke!" she cried, her voice torn with terror. "Keep riding!" he gasped, his voice tight with pain, his head slumping against her back. "Don't stop!" Tears she thought she no longer possessed streamed down her face, whipped away by the wind. She urged the horse faster, fleeing into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the desert. The town, the church, the cage. It was all behind them. Ahead lay nothing but a horizon of red dust and uncertainty. After a mile, when the sounds of the town had faded to nothing, she finally pulled the horse to a halt behind a rocky outcropping. Luke slumped forward, nearly falling from the saddle. She helped him down, his weight heavy against her. He was pale, his face beaded with sweat, his shirt soaked with blood. The bullet had torn through the fleshy part of his shoulder. It was a ragged, ugly wound. Without a moment's hesitation, Clara grabbed the hem of her magnificent, costly wedding dress. With a savage rip, She tore a long, wide strip of silk from the skirt. The sound of the fabric tearing was the sound of her old life being destroyed forever. She knelt in the red dust, the white of her ruined gown a stark surrender flag, and began to press the makeshift bandage against the shoulder of the man she had just freed, the white cloth quickly turning a brilliant, shocking red. They rode west, into the raw, brutal heart of the land. The territory here had no name. It was a place of towering red rock cathedrals, cracked earth, and a sun that bleached the very memory of mercy from the sky. There was no law but the law of thirst, no judge but the circling buzzard. This was the wilderness, and it was a crucible. For 2 days, they pushed the horses, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the life that had tried to strangle them. Clara, the girl who had once fainted at the sight of a pricked finger, became a creature of pure, desperate will. Luke drifted in and out of consciousness, his body burning with fever from the gunshot wound. He would slump against her, his dead weight a terrible, precious burden. When he was lucid, his words were clipped, practical commands from his time as a scout. Follow the dry wash, look for cottonwoods, means water. Then the fever would take him again, and he would murmur names she didn't know. Silas, his brother, his mother, his voice full of a sorrow that tightened a band around her own heart. By the 3rd day, the horses were spent, and Luke could go no further. He slid from the saddle into her arms, his body limp, his skin frighteningly hot. She lowered him to the ground in the scant shade of a granite boulder, his head cradled in her lap. His breathing was shallow, his lips cracked and pale. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she ruthlessly beat it back down. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Survival was a necessity. The girl who had known only parlors and prayer books was dead. In her place was a woman who now had only one prayer: keep him alive. She tended to his wound first, using the last of the clean water from their canteen. She washed away the dust and grime. The bullet had gone clean through, but the flesh was swollen and angry-looking. She remembered tales of poultices from an old book on herbal remedies. She found a plant with broad, waxy leaves that Luke, in a moment of clarity, had pointed out as creosote. She crushed the leaves between 2 stones, mixing them with a little water to make a paste, and applied it to the entry and exit wounds. She tore another strip from her tattered wedding gown to create a fresh bandage, her hands moving with a newfound, steady competence. The ruined dress was becoming a chronicle of their journey, each strip a testament to their survival. Water was the next battle. Following Luke's fever-dream instructions, she left him resting and followed the winding path of a dry stream bed. Her own throat was a desert, her tongue thick with thirst. After nearly an hour of walking under the oppressive sun, she saw them, a small cluster of cottonwood trees, their green a shocking splash of life in the sea of red and brown. At their base, she found it, a small, muddy seep where water, precious and life-giving, bubbled up from the earth. She drank until her stomach ached, then filled the canteens, her heart soaring with a triumph more profound than any she had ever known. That night, she built her first fire. She used the flint and steel from Luke's saddlebag, striking again and again, her knuckles raw, until a single, miraculous spark caught on the tinder dry grass she had gathered. She nursed the tiny flame, feeding it twigs, then larger branches, until she had a steady, crackling fire. It was a beacon against the immense, crushing darkness of the wilderness. It was a declaration. She was here. She would not be extinguished. For days, this became their rhythm. She was the hunter, the gatherer, the nurse, the protector. She learned the landscape, the subtle signs of life, the language of survival. The soft skin of her hands grew calloused and tough. The sun browned her face and arms. She grew leaner, harder, the porcelain doll cracking away to reveal a core of resilient, unyielding steel. She was no longer afraid of the silence or the vast emptiness. She was becoming a part of it. On the 5th day, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. The air grew still and heavy, and a low moan began to rise from the distant plains. Luke, awake and clear-headed for the first time in days, pushed himself up on one elbow. "Sandstorm," he rasped, his voice weak. "We need better shelter, now." He pointed toward a low cliff face a quarter-mile away. "There, look for an overhang. A shallow cave." The wind was rising, whipping sand into their faces. Leaning on her, Luke staggered toward the cliff. They found what he had predicted. A shallow, scooped-out hollow in the rock, barely deep enough to offer protection. It was not a cave, but it was better than nothing. Clara hobbled the horses, securing their reins to a sturdy juniper bush, then stretched a horse blanket across the opening of the hollow, weighing it down with rocks to create a crude, flapping wall. They huddled inside just as the storm hit. The world outside dissolved into a roaring, screaming chaos of wind and sand. The sun vanished. The air inside their tiny shelter grew thick with dust, and the temperature plummeted. The noise was a physical force, a constant, deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the rock around them. Luke began to shiver violently, his teeth chattering. The fever, which had been receding, was threatening a return. Spurred by the sudden cold, his face was pale in the dim, dusty light. "Clara," he shivered, "you need to stay warm." She was cold, too, her thin shirt no match for the chill. There was only one thing to do. It was not a decision born of passion or romance, but of the raw, elemental need for survival. She lay down on the sandy floor beside him, her back to the wind, and pulled him close, wrapping her arms around his trembling body. He was all hard angles and lean muscle, his skin still radiating a dangerous heat. She pressed her body against his, trying to lend him her warmth, her strength. The world was reduced to this small, dark space, to the thunder of the storm outside and the frantic, unsteady beat of his heart against her own. The air was thick with the scent of their bodies, of his feverish sweat, of the sharp, medicinal smell of the creosote on his wound, of the grit of sand and the clean scent of the rain-washed air that was to come. Hours passed. The storm raged. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. In the crucible of the wilderness, stripped of society, of names, of pasts, they were only a man and a woman, clinging to each other as the world tried to tear them apart. Sometime in the deepest, darkest heart of the storm, his shivering subsided. He turned in her arms, his movements slow, deliberate. In the almost total darkness, she could feel his eyes on her. The fever was gone from his gaze, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored her own. He raised a shaky hand, his calloused thumb gently stroking the line of her jaw, wiping away a grain of sand. "Clara," he whispered, and her name was a sound of reverence. It wasn't a moment of lust, of fleshly desire. It was something far deeper, far more profound. It was the communion of two souls who had been dragged through hell and had found heaven in each other's arms. It was the quiet, desperate affirmation of life in the face of death. They had both been prisoners, he in a cage of iron, she in a cage of lace, and here, in the heart of the storm, they were finally, truly free. He leaned in, and his lips found hers, and it was not a kiss of frantic desperation like the one through the bars, but a slow, deep, searching kiss that spoke of gratitude, of awe, of a love forged in the fiercest of fires. It was a promise, made without words, that they were no longer alone. They were the last fire in a long, cold night, and they would keep each other warm until the dawn. When Clara awoke, the world was silent. The storm had passed. A pale, clean light filtered through the horse blanket, illuminating their small shelter. The air was cool and washed clean. Luke was sleeping, his face peaceful for the first time since she had met him. His fever had broken. He was breathing deeply, evenly. She lay there, watching him. Her heart filled with a feeling so vast and powerful it left no room for fear. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, and a slow, weak smile touched his lips. She leaned close, her own lips brushing against his ear, her voice a soft whisper against the silence of the new day. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But last night, in my heart, I became your wife." The land on the other side of the mountain range was a revelation. After weeks in the harsh, unforgiving desert, the valley that unfolded beneath them felt like a half-remembered dream. It was a lush, hidden sanctuary, a crease in the vast landscape that the world seemed to have overlooked. A clear, cold stream cut through a meadow of tall grass, and the slopes were dotted with pine and aspen. Smoke curled from the stone chimneys of a handful of sturdy log cabins, and sod houses clustered near a large, water-powered grist mill. This was Haven. It wasn't a town, but a promise. They rode down into the valley, weary, wary, and cloaked in the dust of their long journey. The people who lived there came out to meet them, their faces weathered by the sun and hard work. They were homesteaders, families who had come west to escape something, poverty, the law, a past they'd rather bury. Their eyes were cautious, but not unkind. An older man with a long white beard and eyes the color of the washed-out sky stepped forward. His name was Elias, and he acted as the community's unofficial elder. "You folks look like you've had a hard ride," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "We have," Luke replied, his hand resting near the small of Clara's back. "We're looking for a place to start over, a place to work." Elias looked them over, taking in Luke's healing but still tender shoulder, Clara's sun-browned skin and the resolute set of her jaw. He saw the tattered remnants of her fine dress, now patched and functional, and the way they stood together, a silent, unshakable unit. He saw two people who had been through a fire and had come out the other side forged into something new. In Haven, they didn't ask for stories. They judged a person by the look in their eye and the calluses on their hands. "There's always work for those willing to do it," Elias said with a slow nod. "The grist mill's been in disrepair for a month. If you've got a mind for machinery, you can have the old miller's cabin. The rest of us can show your wife where the communal gardens are." He had called her wife so naturally, without question. A wave of profound relief washed over Clara. Here, they could simply be Luke and Clara, man and wife. No questions asked. The seasons turned. The harsh heat of summer bled into the golden, crisp days of autumn. The peace they had dreamed of, a fragile, impossible thing, began to take root and grow strong. They moved into the small, dusty cabin by the stream, and with hard work, they made it a home. Luke, with his scout's ingenuity and a natural feel for how things fit together, took to the grist mill. He spent his days replacing worn gears, sharpening the great millstone, and calibrating the sluice gate. Soon, the great wheel began to turn again, and the sound of grinding grain, the heartbeat of the community, returned to the valley. The men, who had been wary at first, came to respect his quiet competence and his strength. He was a good man to have at your side when a roof needed mending or a fence needed stringing. Clara, in turn, found her own place. The community had a dozen children who ran wild, growing up with more knowledge of trapping than of books. With her education, a thing of rare value in this wilderness, she started a small school in the communal meeting house. She taught the children their letters and numbers, read them stories from the one book she'd managed to save, her voice soft but firm. The women of Haven, tough, practical souls, saw in her not a fragile lady, but a woman of deep, surprising resilience. They taught her to knead bread, to preserve vegetables, to stitch a quilt. She became one of them. Their life was simple, stripped down to the essentials: hard work, shared meals, and the quiet, profound comfort of each other's presence. Their nights were their sanctuary. In the small cabin, with a fire crackling in the hearth, the world and its dangers seemed 1,000 miles away. They would talk for hours, sharing stories of the childhoods they had lived in different worlds, their laughter filling the small space, their love, born in desperation and forged in survival, settled into a deep, abiding partnership. He was the steady rock, and she was the bright, warm fire. They were whole. For the first time in their lives, they were truly happy. But the past does not sleep forever. It is a patient hunter, and it had not forgotten them. One day, a trapper passing through the mountains stopped in Haven to trade for flour. He brought with him a month-old newspaper from a town 100 miles east, pinned to the community notice board, among announcements of a barn raising and a lost goat. The trapper tacked up a bounty poster he'd torn from a sheriff's wall. The drawing was crude, but the faces were recognizable, and beneath them, the words were a venomous echo from a life they had almost forgotten. Wanted $500. Reward. For the return of the escaped convict and horse thief known as Luke, and the location of my runaway bride, Clara Mae Thompson, presumed to be in his company. The woman is of a delicate and hysterical nature, and was abducted against her will. The man is armed and dangerous. Nathaniel Blackwood, Harmony Creek. Clara stared at the poster, the words blurring through a sudden haze of fear. My runaway bride, the possessive claim, the lie about her abduction, the casual dismissal of her as hysterical. It was Nathaniel's voice, reaching out across the mountains to reclaim her. Most of the community dismissed it. That ain't you, Clara, Elias said, his voice firm. That poster's talking about some poor, flighty girl, not our school teacher. They knew them. They trusted them. The paper was a lie from a world they had all left behind. But $500 was a fortune. It was more money than most of the homesteaders would see in 5 years. And in any community, no matter how peaceful, there is always a seed of greed. His name was Pete, a sullen, unlucky man whose crops had failed and whose spirit had soured. He rarely joined the communal meals, preferring to watch from the edge of things, his eyes full of a resentful envy. He had seen the poster, and while the others saw a lie, he saw an opportunity. One night, a week after the trapper had gone, Pete slipped out of the valley, his heart full of greed and his mind empty of loyalty. 2 weeks later, on a bright, cold morning, as the children recited their letters in the schoolhouse and Luke was helping to clear a new field, they came. Nathaniel Blackwood rode into Haven as if he owned it. He was flanked by a dozen men, not the ranch hands of Harmony Creek, but hired guns, mercenaries with cold eyes and rifles held at the ready. They were a tide of grim, dark leather and glinting steel, and they washed the peace from the valley in an instant. They found Clara and Luke by the half-plowed field, standing with Elias and a few other men. Nathaniel dismounted, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. He looked different, harder, leaner, the last vestiges of his civilized veneer stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. "Well, Clara," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity, "it seems the wilderness does not agree with you. You look weathered, but don't you worry, I've come to take you home." Luke stepped in front of her, his body a shield, his hand resting on the handle of the axe he'd been using. "She's not going anywhere with you, Blackwood." Nathaniel laughed, a short, ugly sound. "And you're in no position to stop me, thief!" He raised his pistol, the barrel a single, black eye, and aimed it squarely at Luke's heart. "My men have rifles trained on every cabin in this valley. Make one wrong move, and they will burn your little paradise to the ground. Now, step aside." The homesteaders were frozen, their simple farming tools useless against the mercenaries' rifles. Elias looked on, his face a mask of grim fury. But before Luke could move, before anyone could react, Clara pushed past him. She walked forward until she was standing directly in front of Nathaniel's pistol, the barrel almost touching the rough-spun fabric of her dress. She looked her former fiancé in the eye, and her gaze was clear, cold, and utterly without fear. "Hello, Nathaniel," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You will not touch him. If you take him, you will have to shoot me first." For a moment, Nathaniel was speechless. This was not the hysterical girl from the poster. This was not the demure fiancée he had intended to break. This was a stranger, a woman of iron and fire, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of uncertainty. "Don't be a fool. Clara," he began, but his words were cut short. "Put the gun down, Blackwood." It was Elias's voice. He had stepped forward, an old hunting rifle in his hands. From the cabins, from the woods, the other homesteaders emerged, men and women, armed with whatever they had, squirrel guns, pitchforks, axes, and a burning, protective rage. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they stood together, a silent, unmoving wall between the invaders and their own. "This is Haven," Elias said, his voice echoing in the sudden, tense silence. "We have our own way of doing things. We don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and pointing guns at our people." "Your people?" Nathaniel scoffed, though his eyes darted nervously at the determined faces surrounding him. "That's right," said a woman from the crowd, the mother of two of Clara's students. "Clara and Luke are our people. You've made an accusation. So let's hear it. All of it. We'll have a trial. Right here. Right now. And we, the people of this valley, will be the jury." The communal meeting house in Haven was a simple, sturdy structure built of rough-hewn logs, with a packed earth floor and a high-beam ceiling. It smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and the collective hopes of the people who had built it. Now, it was a courtroom. The entire community crowded inside, their face grim and watchful. They stood along the walls and sat on crude benches, a silent, unmovable jury of homesteaders. At the front, before the great stone hearth that served as the room's heart, stood the participants of this impromptu trial. Clara and Luke stood on one side, together, their shoulders almost touching. They were not prisoners in a dock. They stood as members of the community, under its protection. On the other side stood Nathaniel Blackwood, his face a mask of cold fury. His dozen hired guns stood behind him, an uneasy, menacing presence that filled the room with a metallic scent of oiled steel. Between them, acting as judge and mediator, was Elias, his ancient rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm, his expression one of solemn gravity. "Mr. Blackwood," Elias began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "You have come into our valley with guns and accusations. You claim this man is a thief and this woman was taken against her will. The poster you carry makes these claims. Now, you will have your say. But then, they will have theirs. And we," he gestured to the assembled community, "will listen, and we will decide what truth looks like in Haven. Speak." Nathaniel's eyes swept the room with contempt. This was a mockery of justice, a trial by dirt-scratching peasants. But he was surrounded, and he knew that for now. He had to play their game. "The truth is simple," he began, his voice resonating with the practiced confidence of a man used to being obeyed. "That man," he pointed a damning finger at Luke, "is a wanted criminal. He was caught attempting to steal one of my prize horses. To avoid justice, he manipulated my fiancée, Clara Thompson, a delicate young woman overwrought with wedding nerves. He filled her head with lies and abducted her from my care. I have tracked them across this God-forsaken territory not for vengeance, but to rescue her from his influence and see that he faces the proper, legal consequences for his crimes. I am here to restore order, to reclaim what is mine." He finished, looking around as if expecting applause for his noble intentions. The room remained utterly silent. The faces of the homesteaders were unreadable, their eyes like stone. "Thank you for your words. Mr. Blackwood, Elias said, his tone even. Now, Clara, it is your turn to speak. All eyes turned to her. For a fleeting second, the old Clara, the girl who had been taught that her voice was a thing to be kept small and quiet, flickered within her. She felt the weight of every gaze, the menacing presence of the hired guns, the burning hatred in Nathaniel's eyes. She took a breath, and then she felt Luke's hand find hers, his fingers lacing through her own, a silent transfer of strength and courage. She looked not at the crowd, but directly at Nathaniel, and when she spoke, her voice was not the timid whisper he remembered, but the clear, steady voice of a woman who had found her power in the heart of the wilderness. "My name is Clara," she began, her voice ringing in the silent room. "And I was not abducted. I fled from a life that was not a life, but a cage made of silk and gold. I fled from a man who did not see a wife, but a possession to be tamed, a prize mare. He called me." A murmur went through the women standing along the wall. They knew that kind of talk. They had seen it in the eyes of other men, in other places. "My hysteria," she continued, her eyes still locked on Nathaniel's, "was the simple, desperate desire to be free, and my abductor was a man I found locked in an animal cage in my own stable, a cage you, Nathaniel, put him in." She turned her gaze to the jury of faces around her. "He tells you Luke is a horse thief. I tell you that when I searched the sheriff's office in Harmony Creek, there was no warrant for his arrest, not a single piece of paper, because he had committed no crime. He was being held illegally, without trial, a prisoner of one man's personal power." She detailed everything, her words painting a stark, undeniable picture. She spoke of Luke's quest to find his brother's killer, a man named Jedediah Stone. At the mention of the name, she saw a flicker of recognition in the eyes of one of the mercenaries, a man who had clearly heard the name and knew the foreman's reputation. "Nathaniel Blackwood was protecting this killer," Clara said, her voice rising with a passion born of righteous anger. "And Luke was a threat to his tidy, profitable world. So he had him beaten and caged. Is that justice? Is that the law you claim to represent? Nathaniel." Nathaniel's face was ashen, his knuckles white where he gripped the handle of his pistol. "Lies! The ravings of a deluded woman." "Is it a lie that you stood on my father's porch and told me you would tame me like a wild horse?" Clara challenged, taking a step forward. "Is it a lie that you saw me not as a partner, but as an asset for your dynasty? Is it a lie that when you caught me trying to free an innocent man, you had him publicly shamed and beaten, and you locked me in a room like a child? The only crime committed in Harmony Creek was yours, the crime of absolute power, of believing you are above the law, above decency, above the simple truth that you cannot own another person's soul." She fell silent, her chest heaving, her testimony hanging in the thick, charged air. The room was deathly quiet. Then, a man near the back, one of Nathaniel's hired guns, shifted his weight uneasily. He looked at his companions, then at Nathaniel's contorted face, and then at the quiet, dignified couple standing before the hearth. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He wasn't the law. He was a man paid to track a fugitive. He had not been paid to be the private army in a rich man's sordid, obsessive attempt to reclaim a woman who clearly wanted nothing to do with him. Silently, he backed toward the door, slipped out, and mounted his horse. A moment later, another followed, then a third. They were not cowards. They were professionals, and they knew a bad business when they saw one. Nathaniel's power, built on money and fear, was dissolving before his eyes. His authority was a sham, and his private army was abandoning him. He was left with only 4 of his most loyal, most brutal men, who now looked uncertain, their rifles a little heavier in their hands. Elias stepped forward into the space between them. "We have heard both sides," he said, his voice a low, final judgment. "We have heard a story of law and a story of truth. In Haven, we choose truth." He turned his gaze on Nathaniel. and his eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "Your money has no power here. Mr. Blackwood, your threats are empty. You are not welcome in this valley. Take what is left of your pride and your men, and ride out. Do not come back. If you do, the mountains themselves will pass judgment on you." For a moment, it seemed Nathaniel might explode. His hand hovered over his pistol, his face a mask of pure, homicidal rage. He looked at Clara, at the woman who had defied and defeated him, and his eyes were full of a terrible, possessive hatred. But then he looked at Luke, standing solid and unmovable at her side. He looked at Elias and his rifle. He looked at the hard, determined faces of every man and woman in the room, a silent army united against him. And he knew he was beaten. With a final, venomous glare, he turned on his heel and strode from the meeting house. A king without a kingdom. His remaining men followed, their retreat a stark admission of defeat. The community of Haven stood and watched as they mounted their horses and rode away, swallowing the dust of the valley they could not conquer. They disappeared over the rise, and a profound, cleansing silence settled over Haven. The past was finally buried. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the community gathered by the stream. There was no church, no preacher, no fancy dress. Clara wore a simple homespun dress, a gift from the women of Haven. Luke wore a clean shirt, his face scrubbed, his eyes clear and full of a light she had never seen before. They stood on the smooth stones by the water's edge, holding hands, with Elias standing before them. The only music was the gentle murmur of the stream and the whisper of the wind in the pines. "There are no books of law here," Elias said, his voice soft. "Only the laws of the heart. Do you, Luke, take this woman, Clara, to be your wife, to stand with her, to protect her, and to build a life with her?" Luke turned to Clara, and his gaze held all the trials they had endured, all the fear, all the hope. "I do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And do you, Clara?" Elias continued. "Take this man, Luke, to be your husband, to stand with him, to cherish him, and to build a life with him." Clara looked at the man who had shown her what true strength was, the man who had trusted her when she was a stranger, the man who had seen the real woman beneath the porcelain doll. Tears of joy, not sorrow, welled in her eyes. "I do," she whispered. They had no rings. Instead, Luke raised her hand to his lips and kissed her calloused fingers. Then he looked into her eyes, his own full of a love so profound it was a vow in itself. "I choose you," he said, his voice a low, solemn promise that only she could hear. Then, now, and always, the story of the caged cowboy and the runaway bride came to a close not with a clash of steel, but with a quiet promise whispered by a stream. It ended as it should have begun, with two free people choosing each other. They rode out together the next day, not fleeing, but exploring their new world. The sun was setting at their backs, casting their long shadows before them across the red earth. A gentle wind caught the hem of Clara's simple dress, making it flutter like a banner of freedom. Luke reached over, and his hand found hers, their fingers lacing together. A comfortable, familiar fit. There were no more cages, no more bars. There was only the vast, open land ahead, and the unbreakable bond between them. A love story written not in ink, but across the wild, beautiful heart of the West. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales from the frontier, and be sure to share your thoughts on Clara and Luke's journey.